The surrender on May 8, 1945, didn't bring quiet. It brought a strange, heavy confusion. In Berlin, the streets were filled with people moving in every direction at once. Wehrmacht soldiers stripped of insignia walked alongside emaciated camp survivors who could barely stand. In Hamburg and Munich, foreign forced laborers wandered with no idea where home was anymore. Columns of civilians moved west to escape the Soviets, clutching what little they had left. Bundles wrapped in blankets, a pot, maybe a few family photos. Dresden still smelled of burnt wood and flesh from the February firebombing. In Cologne, the cathedral rose untouched, surrounded by blocks of flattened stone like a monument to survival and loss at the same time. The roads were slow rivers of flight. Ox carts creaked under piles of bedding. Bicycles balanced sacks of potatoes and grain. Trucks carried whole families on wooden planks nailed over the bed. No one asked where anyone was going. Papers were the only currency of movement, and many had been lost in air raids or burned deliberately by those who didn't want to be found. In Munich, Viktualienmarkt became more than a food market. You could buy forged identity papers there if you knew the right stalls, and no one asked about the name printed on them. At Red Cross stations across the former Reich, survivors came through with eyes that stared past everyone. They spoke of camps like Stutthof, Auschwitz, Buchenwald. Some could name their guards. Many could not, the faces blurred by exhaustion, sickness, and time. It was a fact that would later let some of those men vanish into the crowd. The Allies tried to hold the tide. Prisoner cages, open-air fields surrounded by barbed wire in places like Bad Aibling, Münster, and Moosburg were crammed with tens of thousands of captured German soldiers. The sheer number made thorough processing impossible. Some men were in and out in under 10 minutes. 7 million surrendered soldiers in just a few weeks meant interrogators were forced to take claims at face value. If a man said he was a cook, a clerk, a driver, there was little time to check. The Americans and British built screening centers to filter the dangerous from the harmless. Civilian internment camp number 1 in Ludwigsburg. Prisoner of war enclosure number 29 at Wilton Park. Even so, low-level SS guards, men who had worked towers, opened gates, kept watch over the condemned, could disappear into the shuffle. In the British zone, there was Operation Nursery, meant to identify Nazi educators and propagandists. But the frontline guards rarely matched those profiles, and some easily walked away. When the war ended, the Allied focus was on the leaders, the planners, and the brutal faces known from propaganda films. The men who had stood watch in guard towers were rarely recognized, and they learned quickly how to make themselves forgettable. In the first weeks after Germany's surrender, many avoided official surrender points altogether, slipping away before Allied patrols arrived. They cut the insignia from their uniforms and buried the pieces in ditches or burned them in farm stoves. A black SS tunic, once a badge of authority, became a death sentence if found in the wrong hands. In the chaos of spring 1945, a man could vanish simply by walking in the opposite direction of a column of prisoners. Some fled toward regions where they had no history, settling among strangers who asked no questions. In Hamburg, the docks were filled with men looking for work, and an ex-guard could join a crew unloading timber from Sweden or coal from Britain without needing to show papers. Others traveled by night to rural districts where Allied presence was light, taking up farm labor in exchange for shelter. These places, far from the ruined cities, were often more concerned with the next harvest than with purging every outsider. For those who feared even the smallest chance of recognition, new identities were essential. Some took on the names of common tradesmen, introducing themselves as bricklayers or carpenters from bombed-out towns in the Ruhr. Others assumed the identities of dead Wehrmacht soldiers, carrying worn paybooks as proof of their false service. A few found sympathetic church officials willing to issue baptism certificates with altered details, giving them a plausible story to present if questioned. By 1946, the more organized escape routes began to operate. Through Innsbruck and Bolzano, guides could lead fugitives into Italy, where monasteries offered food and beds under the protection of the cloth. The San Girolamo Monastery in Rome became known among fugitives as a safe way station, its walls sheltering both petty collaborators and men responsible for mass killings. Here, Father Krunoslav Draganovic acted as a link in the chain, arranging for Red Cross travel documents that erased the bearer's wartime record. The ships waiting in Genoa carried them far beyond Allied jurisdiction, across the Atlantic to Argentina, Chile, or Brazil, where the post-war hunt for war criminals was barely a concern. Those who stayed in Germany learned to keep their heads down. In cities like Bremen and Wilhelmsburg, they worked as dockhands, truck drivers, or bakers, blending into the rhythm of post-war reconstruction. They avoided civic duties that required registration, never traveled abroad, and flinched at the sight of a camera lens. Years later, even neighbors who suspected often kept quiet, either out of fear, complicity, or a belief the past should stay buried. When Joseph Schwamberger was finally brought to court in Germany in 1991, the witnesses spoke of a man who didn't just give orders from a desk. Survivors described how he would ride into the camp on horseback, a pistol in hand, scanning the prisoners for anyone who looked weak or defiant. In Przemyśl, they remembered him executing people in front of the others as a warning. In Mielec, he was known to confiscate gold, money, and valuables from Jewish inmates, pocketing them for himself while the victims were left starving. These accounts had been kept alive for decades, passed quietly from survivor to survivor, until prosecutors could finally present them in a court of law. Schwamberger's path to this point began long before. Born in 1912 in Brixen, Austria-Hungary, he grew up in the economic instability that followed the First World War. He joined the Austrian branch of the Nazi Party in 1933, the same year he entered the SS. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, his career gained momentum. By 1941, he had been posted to occupied Poland, where he rose to the rank of SS Oberscharführer. He commanded forced labor camps in Rozwadów, Przemyśl, and Mielec, where his reputation for cruelty became infamous among inmates. Survivors later described humiliations such as forcing prisoners to kneel for hours, beatings for trivial reasons, and executions carried out without trial. His journey after the war was almost as twisted as his crimes. Captured by U.S. forces in 1945 in Innsbruck, Austria, Schwamberger should have faced justice within months. Instead, in 1948, he managed to escape from an Austrian prison. That same year, like many Nazi fugitives, he boarded a ship bound for South America. Argentina, under President Juan Perón, had become a haven for former Nazis, offering citizenship and protection. By 1959, Schwamberger had built a life there under his real name, living in the city of La Falda and working in relative comfort. He blended into the community so well that his neighbors reportedly had no idea of his past, even as Nazi hunters kept his name on their lists. The hunt for him stretched on for decades. West German prosecutors issued a warrant in 1973, but it took another 17 years for Argentina to act. The turning point came in 1987, when German authorities formally requested extradition and the case began to attract international attention. Schwamberger fought the process, using Argentina's slow legal system to his advantage. But in 1990, he was finally placed on a plane back to Germany. His trial in Stuttgart became a moment of reckoning. The court heard from survivors across 3 countries. They spoke of his habit of personally selecting people for execution, his role in liquidating ghettos, and his systematic theft from the dead. In May '92, Schwamberger was found guilty of 7 counts of murder, 32 counts of accessory to murder, and was sentenced to life in prison. The judge called him a man who lived to kill. Schwamberger spent the rest of his life behind bars, By the early 2000s, age and illness had reduced him to a shadow of the man who had once terrorized entire camps. Yet for survivors and the families of his victims, the sight of him in prison stripes offered a rare closure. He died in 2004 in a prison hospital in Ludwigsburg, still serving his life sentence. From Schwamberger's fate, it's clear that some SS officers could outrun justice for decades, but not forever. Others, like Yakiv Palij, managed to live quietly in new countries, escaping the kind of public trials that brought their crimes into the light. Yakiv Palij's story was almost invisible for most of his life. Born in 1923 in what was then Eastern Poland, he grew up in a farming family. During the German occupation, he was recruited in 1943 as a Trauniki man, one of the so-called highway auxiliaries trained by the SS. At the Trauniki training camp in Nazi-occupied Poland, these men were prepared to guard ghettos, camps, and work details. Palij's role placed him in a system built to confine, exploit, and ultimately destroy Jewish prisoners. Survivors testified that Trauniki guards enforced orders with beatings, intimidation, and armed control, ensuring that no one escaped and that forced labor was carried out under inhumane conditions. After the war ended in 1945, Palij managed to avoid the Allied roundups that caught many SS men and their auxiliaries. In 1949, he applied to emigrate to the United States. On his visa application, he claimed he had spent the war years working on his father's farm and later as a factory worker in Germany. The lie worked. By 1957, he had settled in Queens, New York, becoming a naturalized U.S. citizen. Neighbors knew him as a quiet man who earned a living painting houses and doing odd jobs. His past remained hidden for decades, locked away behind the careful mask of an immigrant starting over. The truth began to surface in the 90s when U.S. investigators, combing through declassified wartime records, uncovered documents placing Palij at Trauniki. In 2001, Department of Justice officials knocked on his door. Palij admitted he had served as a guard, but insisted he had been forced into it. The court, however, ruled that his concealment of his wartime role on immigration forms amounted to fraud. In 2003, he was stripped of his citizenship. What followed was a drawn-out legal battle, not over guilt or innocence, but over where to send him. No country wanted to take him. Poland, Ukraine, and Germany all refused for years. That stalemate lasted until 2018, when diplomatic negotiations finally broke the impasse. In August of that year, U.S. immigration agents arrived at his Queens home in the early hours of the morning. Palij, frail and 95 years old, was taken to a waiting ambulance and flown to Germany. The German government agreed to accept him, though it announced there was not enough evidence to bring criminal charges under their laws. He was placed in a nursing home in Aalen, North Rhine-Westphalia, where he passed quietly in January 2019. Unlike Palij, whose silent life ended without justice, the next SS guard faced a dramatic courtroom reckoning. John Demjanjuk's case became one of the most closely followed and controversial trials of alleged Nazi perpetrators. Born in 1920 in Ukraine, he was drafted into the Soviet Army and captured by German forces in 1942. Like many prisoners of war, he faced harsh conditions in German custody, but instead of being killed, he was sent to the Trauniki training camp in occupied Poland. There, the SS trained him as a guard. Records later indicated that he served at Sobibor, a death camp designed solely for mass murder. Prisoners were sent there in trains, stripped of possessions, and immediately led to gas chambers. Demjanjuk's role, though not one of planning or commanding, made him part of a system that killed tens of thousands. After the war, Demjanjuk emigrated to the United States in 1952, settling in Cleveland, Ohio. He became a mechanic, married, and raised a family. For decades, he lived quietly and was known in his community as a hard-working man. His past was unknown to neighbors and authorities until the late 1970s, when documents surfaced in West Germany and Israel identifying him as Ivan the Terrible, a notorious Sobibor guard. In 1981, U.S. authorities revoked his citizenship, and he was extradited to Israel to face trial. The trial in Jerusalem began in 1986 and gripped the world. Survivors testified about the horrors of Sobibor, and some identified Demjanjuk as Ivan the Terrible. In 1988, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Yet in 1993, the Israeli Supreme Court overturned the conviction after new evidence suggested a case of mistaken identity. Demjanjuk was released and returned to the United States, regaining his citizenship in 1998, only to have it revoked again in 2002, when further documents confirmed he had served as a Trauniki guard at other camps, including Sobibor. In 2009, at the age of 89, he was deported to Germany to stand trial as an accessory to nearly 28,000 murders. The courtroom in Munich was filled with survivors, journalists, and observers. In 2011, he was convicted, making him one of the few former guards from Trauniki to receive a formal sentence decades after the crimes. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but died in March 2012 at 91 before his appeal could be heard. Under German law, this technically left him legally innocent, a controversial outcome that sparked debate about justice delayed by decades, the burden of evidence, and the meaning of accountability so long after the events. Demjanjuk's conviction, despite his age, paved the way for cases for other SS guards, though not without controversy. Johan Rayogen's life after the war was quiet, almost invisible, a stark contrast to the horrors he had witnessed and enforced at Stutthof. Born in 1921 in Romania, he was part of the ethnic German minority there. In 1942, he joined the SS and was assigned to Stutthof, where he worked as a guard for 2 years. His duties included overseeing labor details, making sure prisoners carried out forced work, and participating in selections that decided who would live and who would be sent to the gas chambers. Survivors remembered the guards' authority as absolute. Small acts of disobedience could lead to immediate punishment or death. While Rayogen was not a central figure in planning executions, his role made him an instrument of the camp's deadly efficiency. After 1944, Rayogen returned to civilian life in Germany. He worked ordinary jobs, married, and lived quietly for decades. Neighbors and colleagues remembered him as a normal citizen, someone who contributed to his community, unaware of the shadow he carried from the war. For years, his past remained buried in the paperwork of Nazi records and survivor testimonies, unnoticed in the general flow of post-war rebuilding. Repeatedly postponed, and by the time they could move forward, his health had deteriorated further. Rayogen died in 2021 at the age of 100, before any verdict could be reached. His case became an example of how time itself can obstruct justice. Survivors and historians noted that while documenting his presence and role at Stutthof was possible, the physical and legal realities of prosecuting nonagenarians made final accountability unlikely. Age and health also cut short the justice process for other guard, whose administrative role at Auschwitz later came to light. Bruno Dey's story shows how even the youngest recruits to the SS carried a weight of responsibility that lasted a lifetime. Born in 1926 in Hamburg, he was only 17 when the Nazi regime drafted him into service. By 1944, he was stationed at Stutthof, one of the oldest concentration camps, located near Gdansk. His role was to guard the watchtowers, ensuring that prisoners could not escape. While he did not directly participate in executions, his presence and orders kept the machinery of mass murder running, making him part of the system that sent thousands to their deaths. After the war, Dey returned to civilian life in Hamburg. He took work as a baker and later as a truck driver, blending into the post-war rebuilding of Germany. For decades, he remained anonymous, living quietly and avoiding attention. The townspeople who knew him remembered him as ordinary, a man who raised a family and kept to his work. No one suspected the young guard had been part of one of the most brutal institutions of the Holocaust. Dey's past only came under scrutiny many decades later. In the 2010s, German prosecutors began a wave of investigations into former camp guards, arguing that even those who served as minor functionaries were legally complicit in mass murder. In 2019, authorities formally charged Dey, and the trial captured attention not just because of his actions, but because of his age. By the time the court reached a verdict in 2020, Dey was 93. He was convicted as an accessory to murder for his service at Stutthof. The judge noted that his role, though indirect, had contributed to the deaths of countless prisoners. Yet considering his advanced age, the court gave him a suspended sentence, meaning he would not serve time in prison. As of 2025, Bruno Dey remains alive, a reminder that the line between ordinary life and complicity in extraordinary crimes can persist quietly for decades, only to be confronted when history catches up. His conviction sparked debate across Germany and beyond. Some argued that justice, even delayed, mattered for survivors and historical accountability. Others pointed to the difficulty of punishing elderly defendants decades after the crimes, especially when their actions were carried out as teenagers under coercion. His case stands alongside other late-life prosecutions, like Johan Rayogen, showing how the long shadow of the Holocaust can reach even those who tried to live quietly afterward. Reinhold Hanning's work at Auschwitz made him a small but essential part of the killing machine. From 1943 to 1944, he guarded prisoners during selections and deportations, making sure those targeted for death could not escape. He oversaw labor details and maintained order as transports arrived, directly enabling the murder of roughly 170,000 people. Survivors remembered how the guards' presence, even in seemingly administrative roles, meant that every step of the killing process could proceed without interruption. Hanning's actions were ordinary on the surface, yet they became instruments of extraordinary violence. He was born in 1921 in Germany and grew up during the years of political upheaval that followed World War I. As a young man, he joined the SS, embracing a path that placed him within the Nazi system of power and oppression. His assignment to Auschwitz was part of a larger network of guards and administrators, whose combined efforts ensured the camp operated efficiently. At the time, Hanning, like many others, claimed he was following orders, performing duties he saw as routine, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, the full scale of the atrocities surrounding him. After the war, Hanning disappeared into ordinary German life. He married, raised a family, and worked in regular jobs, blending into post-war society while his past remained hidden. He lived quietly for decades, the camp records and survivor testimonies largely forgotten by the public. It wasn't until German authorities launched a renewed wave of investigations into former camp personnel that Hanning's name resurfaced. By 2016, at the age of 94, he faced trial. Prosecutors argued that even without directly killing anyone, his actions as a guard made him legally complicit in mass murder. Survivors recounted the arrivals of trains, the selections, and the brutal enforcement of orders, painting a vivid picture of how guards like Hanning enabled death. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to 5 years, making him one of the last former SS members convicted. Yet Hanning never served time. His health failed during the appeal, and he died in June 2017 at 96, leaving the legal process incomplete. While Hanning oversaw prisoner confinement, this next guard handled the money, making him the bookkeeper of Auschwitz. Oskar Gröning's work at Auschwitz was meticulous, cold, and deadly, in a way that didn't involve firing a single shot. From 1942 to 1944, he sat at a desk near the arrival ramps, where Jewish prisoners were unloaded from trains, often already terrified and beaten. His job was to collect and organize their possessions: coins, watches, gold teeth, jewelry, even wedding rings taken from the dead. Every item he cataloged, every suitcase counted, fed the Nazi war machine and enabled the camp to function with terrifying efficiency. Born in 1921 in Nuremberg, Lower Saxony, Gröning joined the Waffen-SS as a young man in 1940. He claimed later that he wanted adventure, that he was swept up in the nationalism of the time. After training, he was posted to Auschwitz, where he became part of a system designed to kill without interruption. He was stationed near the processing area of the camp, close to the gas chambers, where people were herded, undressed, and sent to death. He later admitted in interviews that he saw smoke rising, heard screams, and smelled the burning flesh. But he claimed he kept to his work and did not intervene. After the war, Gröning returned to Germany, quietly reintegrating into society. He worked in banking, married, and avoided discussion of his past. For decades, his role at Auschwitz remained secret to those around him. But as Holocaust denial spread in the 1990s, he began giving interviews, at first defensively, and then reluctantly admitting his presence and duties. In 2015, at the age of 93, prosecutors finally brought him to court in Lüneburg. The trial focused on his part in handling the confiscated property that fueled the killing operations. Survivors gave harrowing testimony, describing how trains arrived daily, how personal effects were seized before victims were sent to the gas chambers, and how every action by clerks like Gröning made death more systematic. He was convicted as an accessory to the murder of 300,000 people and sentenced to 4 years in prison. By then, he was frail, suffering from severe health issues, and never served time. He died in March 2018, leaving only his testimony and the records behind. While Gröning kept the books, other forgotten figures lingered in obscurity, such as Gregor Formanek, one of the final living links to the Nazi regime's machinery. Gregor Formanek's death on April 2, 2025, marked the final blow in the long, grim roll call of the SS. He was the last known living former Nazi guard, a direct link to Sachsenhausen and its machinery of terror, and with him gone, an entire chapter of living history vanished. At over 100 years old, he slipped away quietly near Frankfurt, but his passing carried the weight of decades of unpunished complicity. For decades, he had lived in ordinary anonymity, a shadow among neighbors, workers, and family. While his past, guarding prisoners, enforcing brutal labor, standing over those destined for death, remained buried in silence. From 1943 to 1945, Formanek's role at Sachsenhausen made him a cog in a machine of murder. He patrolled the camp, monitored labor details, enforced roll calls, and ensured prisoners could not escape. He did not personally execute inmates, but his presence and compliance directly facilitated the deaths of more than 3,300 prisoners. Survivors recalled the relentless cruelty of guards, how even administrative enforcement of camp rules meant punishment, starvation, and death. Formanek's work was ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in its deadly consequences. After the war, he was captured by the Red Army and spent 10 years in detention before returning to Germany. He settled near Frankfurt, married, worked regular jobs, and lived quietly, blending into post-war life. For decades, authorities and the public were unaware of his past. He existed as a ghost of the Holocaust, a living remnant of the camps hidden in plain sight. In 2024, German prosecutors moved to bring him to trial. Initially declared unfit due to age and health, Formanek was later deemed capable of attending court by December. Hanau prepared for the trial, survivors prepared to testify, and the possibility of accountability, long delayed, finally appeared within reach. But April 2nd arrived, and the last chapter of the SS Guards closed without verdict. Weeks later, on April 30th, the news of his death became public. Formanek passed away without facing a court, leaving survivors, historians, and the world without formal justice. His passing underscored a bitter truth. Decades can protect even the guilty, and the relentless passage of time can deny final reckoning, leaving only memory and history to carry the weight of deeds never fully confronted.